Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. It's the 14th day of March in the year of our Lord 2023. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside, not the Beltway, but Studio West, where the rain will be coming down again. More on that a little bit later. Let's go right to the news. Everything's fine. Don't worry about a thing. Everything is just fine. I said that every day in 2008, and here it is in 2023, and we're still here, and everything is fine. I didn't say that on 9/11. I don't mind bank runs. I don't mind financial scares. They're not great. They're not easy on the stress level of people in the banking world and on depositors and shanky banks and in investors and venture capitalists, but it's not an attack on America. And we've been here and done this before. Let's run through the headlines. Washington Post. Washington's bank rescue fails to erase all doubts. What a surprise. People have no confidence that D.C. knows what it's doing. Shares in U.S. regional banks closed sharply lower over fears of deposit flight. Mind you, in the Financial Times, it's fears of deposit flight. I actually don't think deposit flight is happening, except at a couple of banks that may not have been very well run. Also in the Washington Post, Joe Biden seeks to calm Americans. That's a great one, isn't it? President Biden seeking to calm Americans after the government intervenes in the SVB collapse. Here is the president at the White House yesterday. Cut number one. Or not. Maybe our transponder.
We must get the full accounting of what happened and why those responsible can be held accountable. In my administration, no one is above the law. And finally, we must reduce the risk of this happening again. During the Obama-Biden administration, we put in place tough requirements on banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, including the Dodd-Frank law to make sure that the crisis we saw in 2008 would not happen again. Unfortunately, the last administration rolled back some of these requirements. I'm going to ask Congress and the banking regulators to strengthen the rules for banks. I'm going to ask Congress.
I'm going to ask him to tell me what exactly he's blaming President Trump for. I've been following the SVB bank story very, very closely. And I know Elizabeth Warren is out there saying something about Dodd-Frank, but they were actually extremely liquid. They were just extremely stupid, and they held on to treasuries that were returning very, very low rates of return as interest went up. They made a big bet that interest would come down, and it's got nothing to do with Donald Trump. It's got to do with a very bad group of bankers at the Silicon Valley Bank and the fact that social media and the internet is caught up with bank runs. So I just don't know how you go from those of us in the Obama-Biden years, and the Biden years are completely without fault, but this is all Trump's fault. I don't know how you do it, but that's their story, and they're going to stick with it. Cut number two, Joe Biden reassuring us all, please.
I'm going to ask Congress and the banking regulators to strengthen the rules for banks to make it less likely this kind of bank failure would happen again, and to protect American jobs and small businesses. Look, the bottom line is this. Americans can rest assured that our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe. Let me also assure you we will not stop at this. We'll do whatever is needed. On top of all of it, let's also take a look at a moment to put the situation in a broader context. We've made strong economic progress in the past 2 years. We've created more than 12 million new jobs.
Okay, let's stop with the commercial. I got to point out that the Washington Post also has a story by Abba Batari in it. The Fed's fight against inflation just got downgraded. You see, these rising interest rates are going to cause some bank failures because there aren't the only stupid bankers in the world aren't in Silicon Valley. They're a stupid banker. Look, I know a very smart banker. Brian, if you're listening, I know Brian. I know very, very smart bankers, and I'm sure they've had very long weekends. But if you distribute banking talent, it will distribute on a bell curve and on a risk curve that is also a bell curve. And so bankers are either going to be very risky or very cautious, and they're either going to be very smart or very dumb. The very dumb and very risky bankers are going to be in trouble, and they always get in trouble. And so I'm not going to draw any big lessons about the banking world or about the stability. I think we're fine. I think everyone's liquid. I believe that the new rule, which is reflecting the old rule's idiocy, that $250,000 FDIC insurance isn't enough, that nevertheless, it's all a bailout of elites in Silicon Valley who made bad bets. It's a bailout of a crypto bank signal in New York that made bad bets. And if banks are betting, they're like casino players. If you're going to the casino, don't go to a casino that has a rigged wheel. Actually, don't go to a casino. You're not going to win, right? You're not going to win. So did Joe Biden reassure anyone? Of course not. Jen Psaki unwittingly said the quiet part out loud, cut number 5.
And that's what people need to hear from him. Now, it's important to note, President Biden does nothing at 9 a.m. He is a night owl. So the fact that he is doing this at 9 a.m. anyway speaks to how vital the White House recognizes it is.
If Joe Biden is a night owl, I am Batman. I just think Joe Biden as a night owl is maybe the silliest thing I've ever heard Jen Psaki say. Joe Biden is a night owl, and he's doing something at 9 a.m. Joe Biden is an 11 to 4 guy, and that's okay when you're 80 years old or 81, whatever it is he is. I guess he's 80. When you're 80 years old, you're going to be 11 o'clock. You know, Jamie Lee Curtis the other night looked in the camera and said, Jamie Lee Curtis is my age. Said, Bruce Springsteen, why don't you have a matinee? And she ran through about a dozen groups that she would like to go see. Why not have a matinee? Why not start one of these things at 4 p.m. so I can be home and in bed at 9? That's what people who are 65 generally aim to be, is at home and in bed by 10 sometimes if they're going late. But Joe Biden is 80, so he's not 65. Joe Biden is in bed at 8, and Joe Biden is done working at 4, and you're lucky if you get him there at 11. And so if you want Joe Biden to stop the run on the bank, he's not Jimmy Stewart in A Wonderful Life. It's not going to work. Meanwhile, Karine Jean-Pierre came through with the Air Force One. Again, the automatic rule is exactly the opposite of whatever Karine Jean-Pierre says. Cut number 6. That is true.
Republicans are saying this is a bailout. Is that, how would you respond to that?
No, this is not a bailout. Again, this is not 2008 at all. The funds are from fees on banks and not taxpayers. So this is very different than what we saw in 2008.
This is not a bailout. All right. That was Steve Holland. I think that was the voice of the mighty Steve Holland, one of the best reporters in the White House and a very nonpartisan fellow, saying Republicans are saying, well, so is anyone who's watching this saying this. I would say to my friend Steve, it's a bailout. It's a bailout of depositors who had more than $250,000 in the Silicon Valley Bank. The fact that the bailout is coming from the FDIC doesn't make it any less of a bailout. And the idea that this isn't 2008, well, thank God it's not 2008. We don't want a Great Recession 2.0 just because it's on Joe Biden's watch. It's a crummy run bank. And so I just want people to understand it's a crummy run bank. And it's paying the price. And other crummy run banks will pay the price. But most banks are run by very conservative bankers. They're very conservative bankers. And so their things are not falling apart, except for Joe Biden, who did the Comedy Channel yesterday with Cal Penn. Now, I got to ask you, middle of a banking crisis, middle of a crisis with China. He spent the day announcing that Great Britain and Australia and the United States were combined in AUKUS and we're sending nuclear subs everywhere. He's writing checks he cannot cash, by the way, because we haven't got the sub construction capacity, as Jerry Hendricks' new article makes clear in The Atlantic, which I would urge you to read on Grand Strategy on the Seas. But Joe Biden went on to the Comedy Channel with Cal Penn. I'll play that for you. I'll come back to that. I'm not going to play it for you now. I'm going to ask you this. Is that what the President of the United States should be doing when there's any hint at all of a banking crisis? Go on the Comedy Channel with Cal Penn? Really? That's what you didn't take any questions yesterday. So how safe is Cal Penn? That's what I want to know.
But you have to remember, Ron was a disciple of Paul Ryan, who is a rhino loser who currently is destroying Fox and would constantly vote against entitlements. He would just vote against, remember that, the wheelchair over the cliffs, the Democrats used it. The wheelchair over the cliff commercial, very effective. That was about him. But Paul Ryan's a big reason that Mitt Romney, I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney, lost his election. And to be honest with you, Ron reminds me a lot of Mitt Romney. So
welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That Donald Trump. I'm joined by David M. Drucker. David, it's begun.
Well, it's begun in one direction, at least. Donald Trump's the only Republican running that's willing to hit anybody. And I'm waiting for the other Republicans that are running or thinking of running to strike back. Now, we heard a little bit from Mike Pence over the weekend. Mike Pompeo has dabbled a little bit, so has Nikki Haley. But nobody has done what Trump does, which is what Republican primary voters want to see, because they want to see if you're a fighter. And that's go after your biggest rival. So we'll cut Ron DeSantis a little slack. He's not actually in the race yet. But I think for anybody not named Trump that wants to beat Trump, they're going to have to go at him as hard as he goes at them. And we haven't seen it yet.
Well, we've seen Chris Christie do that. Whether or not one considers Chris a top-tier candidate, he's got his knife out and he's trying to get inside the circle, right? That's what he's trying to do.
He is, and thanks for catching me on that, because he's the biggest distinction. And I've interviewed Governor Christie about this. He understands that the only way you beat Trump is to go at Trump the way he goes at you. It may not work. The voters may react differently to you doing it, but it's the only way to beat him, and it's because of the message it sends to primary voters, at least the most committed primary voters, that if you're willing to go after your Republican opponents, it means you'll also go after Democrats. You'll go after the media. That's a big thing. They want to see proof that you're going to do that, and constantly explaining why you're only attacking President Biden and not the front runner in the Republican race just doesn't work with them.
Now, I want to read to you the statement that Tucker Carlson read last night. Now, I was already asleep when this was done, so I didn't hear it, but I read about it in the New York Times this morning. Tucker read a statement about Ukraine made by Governor DeSantis. Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness with our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them, Mr. DeSantis said in a statement that Mr. Carlson read on his show. What is Governor DeSantis doing there?
He's trying to put himself where Trump is. Yet another way in which a Republican is not contrasting himself with Trump and the populist wing of the party. I also noted in there, Hugh, he referred to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a territorial dispute. It doesn't strike me as a territorial dispute. It strikes me as somebody invading a sovereign nation for no particular reason other than to gain power. And so it'll be interesting to see how Governor DeSantis really talks about U.S. global power and influence in this primary and how he sees it, and what that in fact means for China's territorial ambitions, not just in the Asia Pacific, but around the globe. You talked about this a lot last week with the new Chinese footprint in the Middle East, negotiating that deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of criticism to go around in terms of how President Biden is handling foreign policy, but I think Republicans are going to need to have to distinguish themselves, or it'll be interesting to see if they do, when it comes to, okay, how would you fix the receding of U.S. power under Biden if you're going to recede U.S. influence from Europe and other parts of the globe?
Well, it sets up a very interesting contrast between those who are all in on Ukraine because short of American troops, and both President Trump and Governor DeSantis, who are skeptical of the, quote, blank check. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out. David Drucker, in terms of everybody else, though, I don't think they can wait around much longer, right? If these two guys are going at it, they just cannot wait around very much, or it's going to be eclipse time.
Well, look, I think that they're all going to have to make decisions in April and May. Some may wait as late as June. I think the Republican debates, which are supposed to begin in August, according to the Republican National Committee, are creating a sort of demarcation of, all right, if I'm going to be in this race, I need to be in those debates. And if I'm going to be in those debates, my campaign needs to get off the ground at a particular time. I think the Republicans we're watching the most in this regard are Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence. And I am watching Governor Christie and Chris Sununu, but I'm very curious to see where those two are, given that I know that they are hiring staff or attempting to in the early primary states, but there's still a decision about how they go and when they go. And then again, once they are in, what do they choose to do in regard to Trump? But also from their perspective, Ron DeSantis was the other big dog in this race. He's also trying to hire up in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and we'll have to see when exactly he pulls the trigger. We're expecting it to be after the Florida legislative session is over.
You know, Dave, we'll talk next week. I think if the RNC puts out its metrics for debate participation, that will drive decisions. Because if you need 5,000 small donors with 100 in every state, then we're going to find ourselves some early campaign launches. David M. Drucker on Twitter. Follow him on Twitter, David M. Drucker. Thank you, David, for joining me. I'm coming right back, America. We've got Mollie Hemingway and Byron York coming ahead, Bethany Mandel. We've got Senator Rubio and John Ward. There's a lot ahead on this Tuesday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Donald Trump. Good morning, Byron. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. Doing well. Thank you.
Good. I don't know if you already heard this, but for the benefit of people just tuning in, former President Trump took aim at Ron DeSantis last night. And let's play cut number 16.
But you have to remember, Ron was a disciple of Paul Ryan, who is a rhino loser who currently is destroying Fox and would constantly vote against entitlements. He would just vote against, remember that, the wheelchair over the cliffs, the Democrats used it. The wheelchair over the cliff commercial, very effective. That was about him. But Paul Ryan's a big reason that Mitt Romney, I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney, lost his election. And to be honest with you, Ron reminds me a lot of Mitt Romney. So,
all right, there we have it. Tell me what you think of that, Byron York.
Well, my question is, this is not the first time that Trump has cited the wheelchair over the cliff ad, which was a 2012 ad by a Democratic group portraying Paul Ryan as actually rolling a terrified elderly woman in a wheelchair over a cliff, and you see a body falling down into the water. And that's what Paul Ryan was going to do by destroying your Medicare and your Social Security. And this worked for Democrats. I think it's unusual and interesting for a Republican to be using it against another Republican. So I just wonder if that's going to work. Now, on the other hand, I think Republicans have learned that entitlement reform, which can get some of the Republican base in Washington kind of excited, because Medicare and Social Security are going to go broke, within the next decade. It's a real issue, but it doesn't work. It's not a winner electorally. So I'm not surprised that a candidate has decided not to touch Medicare and Social Security. I am interested that the former president has adopted this Democratic attack line.
Now, there is a fault line that is not policy, but personality driven here, Byron. Now, I like to think of Mitt Romney as a friend of mine. I know Paul Ryan, and I'm very friendly with him, and I get along with him very well. Had lunch with him a couple of years ago. I haven't seen him since. It's not like we're good buddies, but I like both of those men. I like Donald Trump. I enjoy talking to him on the radio. I think it's a temperamental issue. He is identifying nice guy Republicans as a problem. And and Mitch McConnell gets thrown in here by the base as well. Nice guy Republicans don't do well with a portion of the party, but I'm not so sure that's true anymore.
Well, I think that in 2016, Trump revealed something really about the Republican Party. I mean, Trump is the man who brought down the House of Bush, and he brought down the House of Clinton. I mean, the same guy did both of those things. That's amazing. And he kind of was the slayer of Ryanism as well. Trump didn't care about fiscal responsibility. He didn't care about balanced budgets. He didn't care about any of that stuff. That was very, very big to Paul Ryan, who, you remember, didn't want to be Speaker of the House. He wanted to be Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee.
Yep.
So Ryanism fell too in front of before Trump. Now, Ryan had a sort of revenge, in my view, by stopping Trump's efforts to prioritize building a wall, which was his premier campaign promise in 2016, and Ryan didn't want to do, and they did Ryan's tax bill first.
But let's take for a moment, Byron, the key point Trump is making. When George W. Bush won his mandate in 2004, he spent it trying to reform entitlements, and Harry Reid blocked him. It was a no-win. Right. And so Paul Ryan's efforts to make the Budget Committee a centerpiece was not a win. Right. Mitt Romney's affable, hail fellow, well-met, smarter than anyone you know approach did not work. Republican primary voters want a little bit of combustibility, and they want a lot of combativeness. I don't know, and that's what Ron DeSantis is figuring out. And I think everyone's going to have to figure it out, don't you? That it's a temperamental issue.
Well, yeah. Look, the key, the magic secret that a Republican candidate is going to have to discover is how to run against Trump, how to fight Trump. We know how Trump fights them, and he's gearing that up against Ron DeSantis. Although it's interesting, I was on Laura Ingram's program last night. Miranda Devine said, "Well, I don't think Trump has even taken his gloves off yet. This is just a little bit of early skirmishing." But Trump knows how to fight. They know how Trump fights, but they don't know how to fight him. Because,
well, a lot of them are counting on the Manhattan DA taking him out of the race. I do want to play.
That is the wrong idea.
By the way, he will run through an indictment, despite what Chris Christie says about you have to be insane to run for office when you're under indictment. He'll run. Let me play for you Ron DeSantis' statement as read by Tucker Carlson last night. I was already in bed, but I read about it this morning. Here's Tucker reading Governor DeSantis' statement on Ukraine.
And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know. DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, "While the U.S. has many vital national interests," DeSantis writes, "securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question," he writes, "peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable."
So, Byron, what do you make of Governor DeSantis' statement?
Well, I think it is an absolutely legitimate position that needs to be part of the debate on Ukraine. I mean, basically, he has said in this statement I'm looking at right now, he rejects the whole blank check idea, which has become kind of Republican boilerplate now to reject the blank check. He rejects the idea that the United States is in this for as long as it takes. He says peace should be the objective. That is, he wants to see some sort of negotiations between the two sides. He does not rule out American aid and American military aid at all. The only two things he says are off the table are F-16s and long-range missiles, weapons that would allow Ukraine to attack outside its own
I noted
territory.
that, too. And I don't think an F-16, he actually knows what he's talking about. He's a naval intel officer deployed with the SEALs to Iraq. Ron DeSantis actually knows what he's talking about when he talks about long-range weaponry. But I disagree with him on the F-16. I think we could also...
He also comes out against an explicit policy of regime change, because he believes that would increase the possibility of nuclear war. And he notes that whatever the United States' intentions, it seems to have driven Russia into a de facto alliance, that's his words, de facto alliance with China. So I think this is a perfectly reasonable position on Ukraine. People can disagree with it, but it's entirely reasonable. And as you point out, DeSantis was in the U.S. Navy. He served in Iraq and also, by the way, in Guantanamo. So he's seen a lot of elements of the United States war on terror, its most recent wars. So I think it's a reasonable position.
Yeah, I'm not going to trip him up on the triad. That's for sure. He's going to know what he does. But he's also... He's put himself with Donald Trump in terms of Ukraine skepticism, which means the way I see him run, he's going to run a rope-a-dope campaign like you're too young, Byron. George Foreman and Ali in the jungle, Rumble in the Jungle, is that year, 1974? And Ali just takes 100 punches until George Foreman has punched himself out and then knocks him out. Isn't that what he's doing? Isn't that what Ron DeSantis is doing?
Well, it's what he's doing so far. You have to remember, DeSantis is not, he's running but not running. And the idea of not having formally announced in his campaign, I think, has helped him to just stay above the fray. And this is a late starting. It's not a late starting campaign, actually. I was going to mention to you. Have you looked and seen when the candidates in 2016 announced their candidacies?
No. When did they start?
Trump, June 16th. Ted
Wow.
Cruz, March 23rd. Marco Rubio, April 13th. Ben Carson, May 3rd. Jeb Bush, June 16th. Rand Paul, April 7th. Mike Huckabee, May 5th. Carly Fiorina, May 4th, et cetera, et cetera. Much later than we are in this year right now.
We are in the zone, though, very soon. Byron York, thank you. We'll see you on Fox. Follow him at Twitter at Byron York. Follow me to the next segment right here on The Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt live inside of Studio West. Mollie Hemingway is, of course, with Fox News and The Federalist. Good morning, Mollie. How are you?
Great to be here with you.
I want to play for you, Mollie, the statement that Governor DeSantis gave to Tucker Carlson last night on the Ukraine war. And Tucker read it, and he didn't read all of it, but he read most of it. Let's play Tucker reading Governor DeSantis' statement on Ukraine war. Can we play that cut, please, Jacob?
And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know. DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, DeSantis writes, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question, he writes, peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable. DeSantis goes on.
So, Mollie, the key phrase here is it's a territorial dispute. That has drawn the attention of people like Jonathan Swan, et cetera, as signaling Ron DeSantis wants to get out of Ukraine. I think it's much more nuanced than that, but how do you read the DeSantis statement, or how do you hear it?
Well, first off, I just want to say I love that Tucker Carlson asked all of the people who are potential contenders about this issue, and he got a bunch of really good responses. It's just good journalism. It helps people make decisions. And I did agree that DeSantis' answer was interesting because as Florida governor, he's not weighing in on a ton of foreign policy, and so it was just illuminating to get his more fully fleshed out thoughts. So I do think it was nuanced. And I do think, he's talking about not further escalation as opposed to, he's still unclear on whether he thinks we should actually be, pushing right now for some kind of diplomatic resolution. But it was just a really thoughtful statement that explains national interest, foreign policy, how it serves the American people, and why it's something he supports.
Now, I also thought it was great politics because he doesn't want to be separated on national security issues from the Trumpian base, nor does he want to be anti-Reagan, right? That's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, I actually think that a realist foreign policy is very Reagan-esque, and we had this deviation for about 15, 20 years into a neocon foreign policy that really isn't something that Republicans have done. It's much more like Wilsonian, progressive foreign policy, this nation building and democracy building. It's not historic Reagan-esque, or his predecessors' Republican foreign policy. And it is something that is politically toxic. It is damaging to the Republican Party, but it's kind of been like a slow lesson for some Republicans in Washington to learn. But there's nothing, this historic Republican foreign policy is obviously not isolationist. It's fully engaged in the world. It's just focused on making sure that our military resources and capabilities are focused on what's in our national interest and our country's national interest.
Now, Mollie, I'm not a neocon, though my friends on the left think I'm a neocon, and my friends on the right think I'm a neocon. I'm a Reaganite. I was in the Reagan White House. We sent troops into Grenada. George H.W. Bush sent troops into Panama, but mostly what Reagan did was build the heck out of the American military, a 600-ship Navy, and send everything that could shoot to the Mujahideen. Isn't that what we're doing in Ukraine, the Mujahideen part, without doing the other part, the military buildup?
So nobody's ever like a pure neocon or a realist. But Reagan also did things like negotiate with the Soviet Union. He didn't just write them off and say you couldn't like talk to them at all. He also understood that the Cold War wasn't just about what we're doing with our military. It was also about fully engaging in the use of our economy to pressure the Soviet Union. This is the thing that I don't see anybody really advocating for now, in part because, it's not something that works well with a war against Russia, which is what this is, a proxy war against Russia, but it's something we should be doing with China. But no, I think what we're doing in Ukraine risks everything that Governor DeSantis talks about. It is a politically unwise thing to forget that Russia is a nuclear power, that nuclear war is a legitimate concern that people should have in how we wage this, that because Russia is a nuclear power, it never has to accept conventional defeat, and that means that we should be doing some more statesmanship to help Ukraine end this with the least possible trauma to its country. Because, Russia is a bad actor. They did invade this country without justification. They also have this strategic interest that's not going away. And so wise minds could help resolve this without it blowing up, without us sleepwalking into a literal World War III.
Now, Mollie, do you agree with me or disagree? And I really don't know. There's really one adversary. It's Beijing. They have vassal states, and we don't call them vassal states because they have nuclear weapons in Russia, but it's a vassal state of China. And Iran depends entirely upon China to sell its oils to in this current environment. And that we have this new axis of evil, and it's China, Russia, and Iran, or it's actually the Chinese Communist Party, Vladimir Putin, and Ayatollah Khamenei. And that realism about them requires a lot of spending on military prowess, the equivalent of the SDI program, the equivalent of the Pershing IIs and the cruise missiles that Ronald Reagan risked his presidency on before his reelection, and sometimes Iran-Contra kind of stuff. I mean, Ronald Reagan, if he's the model, and I hope he is very, very interventionist in a very smart way. I think that's the model. I don't think Ron DeSantis has ruled that out, by the way. I just think what Reagan didn't do was talk about what he was sending the Mujahideen.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I definitely agree that China is the adversary that needs to be focused on. And one of the concerns I have about how we're waging this war in Ukraine is that we are drawing Russia and China closer together. And also because of the way that we did the economic boycotts even, it has led to opportunities for Russia to build up its economy. I mean, its economy is growing. It's clear that our sanctions have failed if our goal was otherwise. But we should be more laser focused on how to combat China, which at this point does involve, yes, some buildup. We have been just lacking in so many things, whether it's our missile defense or our fleets in the Pacific. But it also requires more of an all hands on deck. I mean, you didn't see during the Cold War against the Soviet Union Hollywood making a bunch of movies about how Soviets were the heroes, or trying to build up the market in the Soviet Union, or trying to help the Soviet Union market flourish. You didn't have big corporations or big media sympathizing so much with the Soviet Union. But that's what we have with Red China. We are fully in bed with them. Our political leadership is fully in bed with them. Even this war is helping Red China with its power and build up. And so we're just being unserious.
Boy, do we disagree on that, Mollie. I think that the worst thing going on for Beijing right now is the bleeding of the Russian arsenal and their increased reliance on China. Look, Xi flipped the script on us, and Mike Pompeo was watching, Mike Pence was watching, Donald Trump was watching. They knew what China was up to. There were speeches by Wray and O'Brien and Attorney General Barr about China. We've been aware of China for probably 5 years now, being an adversary and not a long-term partner in growth or a competitor. That's all nonsense. But to me, the drain on China is quite obvious to the extent that they've got to prop up. They've got a demographic doom loop in Russia going on. They've got one in China that's a little bit slower. And now they've got $100 billion in bad loans all across the world. They've actually kind of got fragile stuff if we push them. if we treat them like an alliance of three and we treat them that way strategically, we'll win again. I'm kind of an optimist about that.
Well, Hugh, I really hope you're right, and I do like the idea of making it toxic to be working with China. It's just we need to be more unattached from them to make that fully work. Our political leaders and our corporations just make too much money off of China to be willing to do what we need to do to really treat them like the adversary they are.
You are right.
But I love your optimism, though.
Well, you're right. I mean, Apple makes the iPhone in China. That's why I don't own Apple anymore, is that they don't know how to get away from that, Mollie. And it's going to require, this is so much more difficult than opposing the Soviet Union because we had no economic integration of two systems. And China and the United States are integrated at a level that most sinologists say is just simply not healthy. Let's go to the Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump dust up if we can. I want to play for Mollie, Governor, the Donald Trump speech in Iowa yesterday, cut 16.
But you have to remember, Ron was a disciple of Paul Ryan, who is a rhino loser who currently is destroying Fox and would constantly vote against entitlements. He would just vote against, remember that, the wheelchair over the cliffs, the Democrats used it. The wheelchair over the cliff commercial, very effective. That was about him. But Paul Ryan's a big reason that Mitt Romney, I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney, lost his election. And to be honest with you, Ron reminds me a lot of Mitt Romney. So I don't think you're going to be doing so well here, but we're going to find out. But those are the facts. But I'm proud to say.
All right, Mollie, what is that all about?
Well, I mean, what it's really about,
But
I
you
guess,
have
is
to
that
remember,
President
Ron
Trump understands that Ron DeSantis is his real opponent in this battle. Not that it's a two-man race or anything like that, but that you look at like 70 to 80% of Republican primary voters are picking Trump or DeSantis. Trump's doing the better of the two, but DeSantis has some strong support, so he's tearing him down. But I think the reason why Republicans like Ron DeSantis is not because of whatever his record was in Congress, which was pretty typical Republican. It's because of what he's done, how he's learned, how he's grown in the last few years, and how he has led the state of Florida. And so I'm not sure how effective these attacks on DeSantis will be. At the same time, I think DeSantis has a huge challenge because if and when he joins the race, it'll be just as difficult for him to go after Trump as it is for Trump to go after DeSantis.
You know what Senator Cotton says? He quotes the professional wrestler: "If you're going to beat the man, if you're going to be the man, you got to beat the man." Right? So eventually, they have to square off. Eventually. Mollie Hemingway of Fox News. Thank you, Mollie. Don't go anywhere, America. I'll be right back, right here on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening today. Bethany Mandel is one of my favorite authors, but I want to talk to her about a book signing she did. Good morning, Bethany. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. How are you?
Well, I got out of Virginia right before all 5 of my grandchildren came down with strep throat or ear infection, so I'm hoping to have gotten out of town before the endless cycle got me. Your house must be the same way, right?
So I'm not going to jinx myself, but we've had a very good winter. I don't know what happened, but I never wanted to change anything. So I'm not going to answer that question. I plead the fifth.
Okay, don't. All I know is that my son-in-law spent Sunday at the not-so-urgent care getting pink stuff. Bethany, what happened at this book signing? I want to know what happened because I've read 2 accounts and you told me the baby was not hit. I'm glad to hear that. Was the baby ever threatened?
God. No, so what happened was we released Stolen Youth on Tuesday. See how I inserted Stolen Youth? That was because of you.
7 times, you got 2 down, 5 to go.
So we released Stolen Youth on Tuesday, and we had a book party on Wednesday to celebrate the release of Stolen Youth. And so we had Steve Forbes at the party, who is someone I just absolutely admire and adore to the ends of the earth, and so much so that Carol and I took a selfie with him, and he was the only person at the book party that we took a selfie with because we were so excited. And I was standing at the entrance talking to him, and all of a sudden books come flying at us I'm soaking wet and I'm just completely flabbergasted. And so what is going on? And people are screaming at us, and they're like straight out of Central Casting. Young white women with the blue streaks in their hair, purple streaks in their hair, screaming Black Lives Matter and Trans Lives Matter. And at first, gullible, naive me, I'm like, they must be confused, because I don't know why they're screaming Black Lives Matters at us. We don't talk about Black Lives Matter in our book, really. And then I realized, oh, they're just like, that's just the approved chant. That's the only thing that they know how to say or are able to say. And so they're screaming at us, and then they run out like petulant children. And that's exactly what they are. They're, petulant children.
Bethany, I got to say, this sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit. We take
Totally
the absolute
was.
nicest man in America, Steve Forbes, and we match him up with the mother of six, who is homeschooling, and they become the subject of the wrath of the left. That's just kind of a comic take on everything, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it was perfect. It was honestly perfect. And thank God, like, I can laugh about it because I had brought my 2-month-old, because we had a full day of press. I woke up at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, and I didn't get home until close to 1 a.m. So it was a really grueling day, and I'm still nursing him. And so I had to bring him. And thank God one of my best friends had taken him 5 minutes prior and said, I've never met this baby. I'm going to go snuggle with him on the couch over there. And thank God I wasn't holding him. If I was holding him, it would have been like an absolute beatdown. Like the videos that you see on social media of women like pummeling each other, that would have been me. So
if Mom had been fighting for her cub, that would have been very different indeed. Where was this? Was it Book Soup? Well, I mean, not Book Soup. What do we call Pages? What's the one in D.C. down by the harbor? Where were you?
No, so this was in New York. This was at a restaurant in New York, and we kind of had taken over the entire back area of the restaurant, and we were very quiet about this party. We never said publicly that we were having one, obviously never said where it was. So we think that there were, these young women who happened to be in this very expensive restaurant in Manhattan who were walking to the bathroom, because we had the prime placement next to the bathroom. And I think that they saw the book and Googled it and said, this is our moment. This is our moment to defend Black lives and trans lives. And they went on the warpath.
Well, I want everyone to buy Stolen Youth, just to give them. I want them to know they help you sell books, right? I want the radical left to understand that they help Bethany Mandel sell Stolen Youth, and Stolen Youth is available now. I'm ready yet. Your publisher has not yet sent me Stolen Youth. Nudge, nudge. You're becoming like Jim Garrity, who I never get a book from, ever. John Ward got me his book like 3 weeks before publication, and but I'm very glad to hear that. Now the question becomes, what do you take away from that? Because the idiocracy on the left has its parallel on the right, correct? I mean, we have idiocracies on the extremes, but the idiocracy on the left gets away with a lot more than the idiocracy on the right.
So, I mean, this is exactly why we wrote Stolen Youth, because there are millions of American parents who don't want their children turning into petulant adults who behave like children, who throw their drinks at Steve Forbes and New York City restaurants. The book is about... I know,
Steve Forbes, 75 years old. Is he 80? He's like he's the nicest man in the world. It'd be like throwing your drink at Joe Biden. No conservative's going to do that. They're old men.
I wouldn't go that far. But yes, no, I mean, he is the nicest man on the planet. His entire family are delightful. I adore the entire Forbes family and want to be adopted. But I mean, the reason we wrote...
Get in line, Bethany. You're behind me in the adopted line for the Forbes. But go ahead.
So the reason we wrote Stolen Youth was because we knew that there were millions of American parents who were afraid of the indoctrination that their children were experiencing in every component of their life, in every corner of their lives, and they didn't want their children to turn out like these people.
That's in a nutshell. Stolen Youth needs to be read and given to every parent in America, because it's the perfect title, by the way, Bethany. Stolen Youth. That's really the combination of everybody's concern. Leave the innocence of our children out of it. Bethany Mandel, I'm glad you're safe and the baby is safer, and Steve Forbes is dried off. Keep coming back. Tell your publisher, you forgot the guy who I talk to every week. All right, I'll be right back. Beginning this hour with United States Senator Marco Rubio. He is vice chair of the Senate Intel Committee. He's also a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think he might be the ranking member now. I'm not sure. Senator Rubio, welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Hey, Hugh, thanks for having me.
You know, I wrote about you last week in the Washington Post, and I didn't talk to you, which is bad journalism. So this is in reverse order. You're ranked number 5 over at Real Clear Politics among Republican preferences for president. But I wrote in the Post column, I didn't think you were running. Am I right? Are you not running in 2024?
Yeah, I don't have any plans to run for anything this year because, you know, timing is everything in life, and we've got a lot of stuff going on. I've really been focused on. I was hoping we'd be in the majority these next 2 years, and that was what I was focused on. But now we're in the minority, but we have a majority in the House. So, you know, I have a bunch of things we're working on, and that's really what I've been focused on. President's not the kind of thing you can just decide, you know, overnight to do. You know, you got to prepare yourself for that and have all the infrastructure in place. So I have no plans or intentions to do anything, run for anything over the next couple of years.
Okay, great. Then I wasn't wrong. Now let's turn to the key thing, which is Ukraine. Last night, Governor DeSantis sent Tucker Carlson a statement about Ukraine that Tucker read. I was already asleep because I get up at a ridiculous hour, but I've had it played for me. I want you to hear it and get your reaction to it. Here, Tucker reading Governor DeSantis' statement on Ukraine.
And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know. DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, "While the U.S. has many vital national interests," DeSantis writes, "securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question," he writes, "peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's 2 largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable."
All right, so Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio, that is a statement of Governor DeSantis' policy. Let's begin with your view of American assistance to Ukraine, and then compare the two.
Yeah, so I think we do have an interest. I don't think it's the number one interest in the world. Obviously, I think our geopolitical competition with China is by far the single biggest foreign policy priority that we need to have, and it's a comprehensive one. But there are elements of that that are linked to what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. So my view of it is this, and that is that there is national security interest as it comes to that, but it is not an unlimited national security interest, and our contribution to them should be commensurate to that, at the same level as our interests are. So, right now, the Chinese want Russia to be successful in Ukraine. They want them to be successful for 2 reasons. The first is because they believe that it's keeping us distracted. And the other is because I think it helps to lay the groundwork and set the precedent for what they intend to do in terms of Taiwan and then the other areas. And so what they want to be able to tell the Indo-Pacific region is, the Russians invaded Ukraine. People complained about it for a while, but in the end, they all backed down and Russia got what they wanted. What makes you think they're going to stand up to Russia, which has a bigger economy and a lot more power to China than what makes you think they're going to stand up to China when they couldn't stand up to Russia? So that's now. The F-16s and the planes. My biggest problem with those is I don't believe Ukraine can use them because the Russians have anti-air assets embedded deep inside of Russia that can reach those airplanes almost the entire Ukrainian territory. So the risk of getting shot down is very high. But by the same token, I don't think if we just stop helping Ukraine that the result is going to be peace. I think if we stop helping Ukraine, the result is going to be a slaughter. Followed by, we now live in a world where the message will be pretty clear, and that is that if you want to invade a smaller neighbor and take their land, you can do it, and there won't be many consequences for it. So what I'm not in favor of is funding a stalemate, an ongoing war that's going to take forever. And I think that's where the Biden administration has really fallen short, is their inability to lay out a strategy for what our national security interests are and what we're doing to further those here. Instead, it's just sort of like all about money and how much money are we sending and how much equipment we're sending. None of it tied to a broader outline of here's our strategy, here's our interest, here's why we're doing it.
Now, I don't think Governor DeSantis' statement is neo-isolationist at all. Some of my conservative hawk friends question the use of the term territorial dispute to describe Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. Do you think he's neo-isolationist, and do you think it's a territorial dispute?
Well, it's not a territorial dispute in the sense that any more than it would be a territorial dispute if the United States decided that it wanted to invade Canada or take over the Bahamas. Just because someone claims something doesn't mean it belongs to them. This is an invasion. I mean, the Russians basically decided that we want a government in Ukraine that we have control over. And their goal was, we're going to go in, we're going to topple their government, or they're going to abandon the country, and then we'll install a puppet through some fake election, and then they'll be in our orbit of influence. And by the way, we'll probably keep Crimea and maybe some areas of eastern Ukraine as well as Russian territory. And their goal was to set up a fake referendum where the people there voted in favor of that. That was their goal. It hasn't worked out that way, obviously, but that was always their goal. And so this is not the same as two countries arguing over disputed boundaries that were settled in some treaty 50 years ago. I mean, this is basically the Russians want Ukraine to be under their thumb. And since Ukraine was headed westward and they're thinking, we go back to, all of the things that happened in 2014, that's really what triggered all this, is Ukraine said, we want to join the European Union. And that's really what fired up the Russians to go in and do what they did in the first place back then. So it really is more of a desire to dominate their neighbors and have them as part of their sphere of influence. Not so much about the land.
Senator, I view this as a great division of the world into two camps. Beijing is the capital of the Russia-China-Iran alliance, and the United States is the capital of the Western alliance. And the bad guys have invaded not our ally, but a key country that borders on all of our Article 5 allies under NATO. So it's not really a territorial dispute, but I think what Governor DeSantis is trying to do is not upset the neo-isolationist voter. Am I right about that?
Well, I don't know what he's trying to do or what the goal is. Obviously, he doesn't deal with foreign policy every day as governor, so I'm not sure. I can't compare that to something else he did or has said over the last few years because he doesn't deal with it every day. But I will say to you that in terms of my view of the overall issue is, I think there's nuance because foreign policy is about nuance. It's not one way or the other. I mean, so there is a way for us. There is a national security interest in Ukraine. It's not the number one national security interest the United States have, but it's an important one. And there are things we can do and should do to further that interest by helping them. It's not an unlimited interest. It's not $60 billion every 6 months. But there are things we can do and should do, and that our partners in Europe should do more of as well, and are doing. And I do think there's some importance to it. And I think those of us who feel that way have an obligation to sort of explain to people how this fits in the broader overall package. Well,
is that missing? The expansion of NATO is the best thing to happen in my lifetime since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if we can get Finland and Sweden into NATO, that is a huge win for the national security of the West. Do you agree with that, Senator?
I do, because those two countries are actually, they have a defense manufacturing base. Those two countries have not been a part of NATO, so they've been providing for their own defense for a while. I think there would be a net positive. I mean, you're not bringing in two needy countries. You're bringing in two countries that have military capabilities of their own that could really help in a situation like this and are helping. So without being part of the alliance yet. And so but the broader point here is that if you look at Beijing, right, because our number one focus is that they want Russia to be successful. Their fear is that if Russia is severely degraded, well, we knew they were meeting and we knew that was the aim. Obviously, I'm not sure how strong that true agreement is. The differences between a Sunni Arab kingdom in Saudi Arabia and a Shia Persian one in Iran are enormous, and I'm not sure China alone can bridge that. But it's a big diplomatic win for them. I wouldn't say it's earth-shattering, but part of this is the Saudi kingdom really dislikes Joe Biden, and they're really upset at the way he's treated them. So
that is, by the way, the lens through which I viewed it. But I'm just glad to hear you were not surprised. Senator Marco Rubio, always great to talk to you. Thank you for joining me, Senator. Follow him on Twitter at Marco Rubio. Follow me to the next segment of today's Hugh Hewitt.